Movie buff specialist Phil and John are back, and we are into episode number 71, and we are into our top 30 films of all time. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Little Miss Sunshine from 2006 and the Twin Peaks movie, Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me, which came out in 1992 and quite divided, and it's fun to talk about in retrospect because it has become more of a cult hit, even though at the time it was what nobody wanted. Two very different movies. One is terrifying. One is not meant to be terrifying at all. And here we are. Little Miss Sunshine, Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me. John, I haven't watched all of Twin Peaks since 2011, I think. I watched, and that doesn't count The Return. Yeah. I've rewatched season 1 quite a few times. Rewatching season 2, I've never really gotten around to. It's not that I don't like season 2, just never really got around to it. Haven't seen this movie since around that same time. So like 2011, 2012. And here we are 10 years later, first time I actually sat down and watched it. So it was a little bit difficult for me this time. I'm not going to lie, but you're the Twin Peaks guru here. So what do you got about Twin Peaks?
What don't I have about Twin Peaks? Yeah, Twin Peaks is absolutely my favorite television program of all time. It was an absolute phenomenon when it started in 1990. And season 2 concludes with one of the, okay, I'm just going to put it out here now. There are spoilers for Twin Peaks going to happen on this podcast. It's impossible for us not to talk about the show when we're talking Fire Walk With Me. But season 2 ends with one of the biggest cliffhangers in TV history. It's like, I don't know, the end of season 2 of Twin Peaks and the original run of Twin Peaks is probably like Who Shot JR levels of cliffhanger when it comes to TV moments. And leading into 1992, we find out, David Lynch is making this Twin Peaks movie, and everyone's super excited. They think it's a follow-up. They're going to finally figure out what happened to Coop in the Black Lodge, and the fact that Bob is now possessing Coop and everything. And David Lynch says, none of that. This is a prequel movie.
Yeah.
And it just completely... People were upset. People were so angry when this movie came out. I mean, there were rumors for a very long time that it was like booed at Cannes. It was not. It received a standing ovation at Cannes. It was very well received by critics and everything. But the general public weren't really prepared for this because this is an actual David Lynch movie. Whereas Twin Peaks is kind of a little more accessible when it comes to David Lynch because he's working with Mark Frost, he's working with all these other
he's working with a network. He doesn't have a choice.
Yeah, but this is a David Lynch movie, and I love it. I absolutely love it. I love what it does to the mythology of Twin Peaks. I love the fact that we take Laura Palmer, who is the symbol of hope and the good in the world, and we finally get her as a character because we didn't get that at all in the original series, despite the fact that David Lynch absolutely loved Cheryl Lee. Cheryl Lee was hired to play a corpse on Twin Peaks, then had another character written onto the show just so she could act in the show, and then gets an entire movie afterwards. And what this movie does is what I find this movie does is this movie demonstrates what the actual themes of Twin Peaks were, because the show is a little soapy at times. It's a weird soap opera, but it's still kind of a soap opera when you get down to it. And what this movie did was it just says the main theme of Twin Peaks is the struggle between good and evil. It's this meditation on evil and how it just permeates within mankind. And it is terrifying. It is downright terrifying. There's arguments as to whether this movie is a horror movie or not. I don't think there's any question about it. This is a terrifying movie when you start breaking it down.
Yeah, I agree. I will say that I didn't like this as much on this viewing as I did on the first viewing that I had of it. Now, granted, that was a while ago, different mindset. I had just recently watched Twin Peaks. And so that might just be why I enjoyed it more that time. And I think it could be a different take entirely if I remembered more of what was going on in the show. I remember the big plot points, but huge loss here on Lara Flynn Boyle not coming back. Really hate that Audrey Horne isn't in it. Like, to me, Audrey Horne, one of the great characters in TV history, not being in this is a shame. Like, they're really missing a lot by not having her in it. What actually hurts this for me, though, and John, this is going to piss you off, so I'm just prepped for you to be angry, but let me get my thought out, because I don't know who's in the minority here, but I think Lynch fans will just always say that the other person is in the minority, even though I will forever say that the return sucked. I was so frustrated by what the return did, and I was just flat out bored with so much of it, that I actually think that made me like this less, because, and this is my big because it was like Lynch had 2 tries to just tell the story of what actually happened to Cooper, and instead he just went full Lynch on it. And that's the question everybody wanted answered. And I'm sorry, but watching 15 episodes of this guy walk around and bump his head on things because he can't do anything isn't fun to me. Like, it's just not enjoyable. That's not what I want. And I think the problem with going from TV show to movie, and I don't think that this is a problem that you run into by just making movies. Like, David Lynch can do whatever the hell he wants, and I'll watch it. We talked about Inland Empire earlier on. We both have Mulholland Drive super high on our list. He made The Straight Story, which is a G-rated Disney movie. He can do whatever he wants. But I think the problem when you go from TV to movie is there's such a level of expectation that needs to be met. Because when you're making the TV show, the studio has such a hand in everything that's going on, to the demise of Twin Peaks season 2. And granted, I still really like Twin Peaks season 2, because once Heather Graham comes in, it's phenomenal. But it is to the demise because they forced him to reveal his hand and he didn't want to do it. And it leads to 4 or 5 really terrible episodes that then start to pick up again. But my biggest problem is you went then and made a movie that doesn't get into the root of what I wanted to know. And I think that's an expectation that just automatically comes with making a movie based on a TV show. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I think that's why I gave this 3 stars rather than 3.5 or 4. Granted, I'd probably bump this up if I watch the show again. I have the gold box edition or whatever it is. So I know that I'll watch the show again at some point. But I do think that because of what the expectation is, look, this is an awesome movie. I mean, the story with Laura Palmer and all of that is really cool. But Cooper is the heart and soul of Twin Peaks. I don't care what anybody says. And for Cooper to not be resolved really in any way, shape, or form, it's too ballsy of David Lynch. And in my opinion, it's just unnecessary of him. And it's just self-righteous of him, which he is, and he's whatever. But I just think it's too much.
So there is some background into how this movie came out to be what it inevitably became. Initially, David Lynch did set out to have a Cooper story, but Kyle MacLachlan turned it down because he didn't want to be shoehorned into this role. And I mean, Kyle MacLachlan is a perennial Lynch collaborator at this point. Like, it's not like he dislikes working with David Lynch by any means. But he was really worried he was going to get shoehorned into this role. And yes, it is his most iconic role.
Yeah.
But he did get to branch out a bit after this. Lara Flynn Boyle just had I think 4 different film commitments that interfered with this filming for this film, which is why she's replaced with Moira Kelly. A weird choice. They look nothing alike.
They look nothing alike.
But I think it's almost justifiable if you think of it that Moira Kelly kind of has more of an innocent look to her than Lara Flynn Boyle did. And for me, I've watched this film so many times at this point. I rewatch it every time I do a watch through of Twin Peaks. And I watch Twin Peaks every single year. So I watch this movie a lot. And what I've kind of like come to decide is that, and it only really works post-return because you have a little more idea of how the world works after the return. But I think Moira Kelly kind of shows like this innocence of Donna. And the fact that we see Lara Flynn Boyle only after Laura's dead, it shows that transition
Mhm.
of Donna, and it shows her maturing rapidly and being forced to transition. And I mean, we get that sequence in Canada in this film
Which is the best
where
part of the movie, in my opinion.
I mean, it's absolutely phenomenal. It's
Yeah.
Lynch just overrides all of your senses and just wants to overload everything. It's so loud you can barely hear the dialogue. It's bright, it's flashing, it's dark and gritty at the same time.
Mhm.
And when you see Laura freak out because Donna's like, lying there without a top on being licked by a guy, it's such just like this pivotal changing moment in Donna that we get to see then in the series that takes place after this.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and again, I guess what my biggest problem with the movie, because I like that scene's awesome. The Chris Isaac stuff at the beginning is great, even though it kind of is what it is. But it's fun for sure. I mean, I like the Chris Isaac stuff. I think that really sets up a good mystery with Kiefer Sutherland, all of that. For me, it's more of the stuff that happens in Twin Peaks.
Mm-hmm.
I love the Canada stuff. I love this stuff with Kyle MacLachlan at the beginning and Kiefer Sutherland and all of that. I think it's great. But the stuff that actually occurs in Twin Peaks, there's no Big Ed. There's no Michael Onkeen. I'm just going to start naming actors because I can't think of what they are. There's nothing at the Great Northern, which to me, the Great Northern is some of the best stuff in the entire show. Now, I understand a lot of those actors. Had Jack Nance died by this point, or was he still alive? I can't remember.
I think he was still alive at this point.
He was still alive, but love Jack Nance. I understand Piper Laurie's not going to come back. Joan Chen doesn't do anything anyway, but like Richard Beamer and we don't get the doctor like at all, whatever his name is. I can't remember his name. Audrey's not in it. Like those are the things for me that set this back a little bit. Now, again, that's because of expectation. And it's not really, it's Lynch's fault and it's not Lynch's fault. Lynch did not make a bad movie with Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me. And that's not what I'm trying to say by any means. I really enjoy this movie. But because of what he had done with Twin Peaks and because of what everybody had experienced with Twin Peaks, the TV show, Fire Walk with Me came with expectations. David Lynch isn't a guy that hits expectations. Even with The Return that you loved and I thought was horrible, the thing is, he's not trying to hit any expectations. He's just trying to do what David Lynch wants to do. And I think the problem, that's one of the biggest harms to Fire Walk with Me, is that he doesn't hit the expectation because he doesn't care. And that's fine. He does not care, though. And it's the stuff that takes place in Twin Peaks that ultimately for me is just like, okay. Although Ray Wise is amazing in this.
Ray Wise is amazing in everything. He's just like one of those fantastic bit actors that we get in. I mean, he was all over everything in the 90s and the 2000s, and he's just phenomenal every time he appears in anything. His like the dinner table scene where he wants Laura to wash her hands, and he's specifically looking at her left ring finger, which is the finger that's going to have the letter jammed under it later. It's terrifying. It's frightening. And at this point, I mean, everyone who's seen Twin Peaks knows that Leland is possessed by a Bob. But in this film, Laura's figuring that out right before she gets killed. And why I really enjoy the things that happen in Twin Peaks in this movie, because it's not about Twin Peaks. This movie is about Laura Palmer. Right? The TV show was about this wide cast of characters. And we get, some people show up. We get Shelley. We get Donna. We get James. We get Bobby. Like, we have some of these characters here. We see Teresa Banks for the first time.
Yeah.
I
like the Ronette Pulaski. Like, that stuff.
Yeah, fun. And we get Ronette and everything. But this is showing us Laura Palmer the person. Because throughout all of Twin Peaks, we never see Laura Palmer the person. We get Laura Palmer the myth. And it's so drastic, this myth, because it's oh my God, she's this perfect angel. Like everyone loved her. She did like the Meals on Wheels and she helped everyone all the time. And we knew she had this dark side that was evolved throughout the show. But here we get to see that duality of her. And the way things are positioned in here, even like there are some weird moments in this movie that it's like, I can't believe Lynch decided to bring that up. Like Harold being in this movie. It's great because it answers the question of how Harold got Laura's diary. But it seems like a weird choice. But in that moment, you still get to find out that, I mean, Bob's been having his way with Laura since she was 12 years old. And that explains where this darkness is coming from. It explains, I mean, it's built on more in The Return. And I do love The Return. I think The Return is a perfect season of television. I think it is absolute 18 hours of masterful artistry the entire time. And I do think it really does a lot to strengthen Twin Peaks. And I know people complain about Dougie. Dougie is a character that every time I rewatch The Return, I like more and more. I love that character now. And that's not just me being some like Lynch fanboy. That's me actually like, diving in. I mean, it is, but it's not just that. It's me also just like diving in and understanding it more and more with every watch. And that's how I feel about Fire Walk with Me. Every time I watch this movie, I like it more. I was sitting here watching it this weekend thinking, is this movie going to move up in my top 100? And if it doesn't, it's only because of the caliber of movie I have above it right now.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's the fun part about once you hit this part of your top 100 is you're just going to have movies that you absolutely love. That's why they're this high up on your list. I look at with Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me. I love a lot of like the Lynch things that happen in the movie for sure. Like, I think there's some cool moments. The horse, the scene with Bob the first time, and then her realization later that dad was home and that's who it was. Like those types of things. Grace Zabriskie just even being in this movie. She's such a great Lynch actress. She just really gets David Lynch and is like really fun to watch take on his roles. But I mean, I like that he plays him, that he's Gordon Cole again. Like Gordon Cole is such a fun character. To me, it's like season 1 of Twin Peaks is perfection. Season 2 is damn near perfection. If it was his way, it would have been perfection, but it just loses its way briefly. But it ends with massive cliffhangers. I mean, all of those season 2 cliffhangers. You have Audrey blowing up in the bank. You have you have Dale Cooper in the red room. All of these things. That's what this movie's missing. And it's hard because how do you sit down and watch this movie and rate it properly on its own? That's what I think I have the hardest time doing at this. And that's why, like, doing a podcast like this, it's fun because you have it at number 30. You're a huge Twin Peaks fan. I'm a huge Twin Peaks fan too, but not nearly as big as you. So it's like, okay, I really like Twin Peaks. You absolutely love Twin Peaks. You can properly put this where you want to. For me, it's so hard to separate this from everything else. And while I really enjoy the movie, part of me is disappointed every time I watch it because I'm like, well, why didn't they do this? Because as much as I like David Lynch, I still really do like stories that go the way I want stories to kind of go. Like, or, you know, you can take me down a unique avenue, but you got to take me there. And sometimes I feel like Lynch doesn't take me there. And it's so hard for me. And I think that's why I landed at 3 with this. Cause it's like, it's certainly a good movie, like verging on great in my opinion. And obviously for you think it's phenomenal, but it's hard for me I wish I could just sit down and watch this and not
disassociate it with like the
just disassociate. It's almost like watching what do you call it, Survivor Marquesas. If I could just enjoy Boston Rob there and never know he was going to play again, oh how wonderful life would be. But you can't, and then it just kind of it's like whatever. So that's why this is such a tough one for me, but I do really enjoy this movie.
It's really hard because it's not even like you could watch, despite this being a prequel, you can't watch this movie before Twin Peaks either.
Yeah, you can't because you won't know what's going on.
It gives you you might for the most part. Like a lot of this story is pretty self-contained in the world of Twin Peaks. Yes, as people who've seen the show, you get more of these references. You get like you know who Teresa Banks is. You know the
You'd be
importance
very
of Teresa
confused by
Banks.
James and Bobby if you had not.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, I think the biggest thing to his detriment is actually just the fact that it reveals that Leland is Bob in this movie, right? And that takes away the great mystery of the first season and a half of Twin Peaks. But there are so many little things in this movie that I think really add to the mythology of Twin Peaks. I love the scene with Lil. Like, it's the scene at the beginning where Desmond meets Cole and, his sister's girls there and everything like that. Right? And I love when he's explaining that to Kiefer Sutherland's character. And it's just like David Lynch is literally sitting you down at the beginning of this movie telling you how to watch a David Lynch movie.
Yeah, pretty much.
And I think that is such a genius way to kind of segue the casual Twin Peaks fandom who like watched the show as it aired into slowly getting into understanding a David Lynch movie. And especially because like we're introducing these characters, it's like we see Gordon Cole, we know who that is. We have no idea who Desmond is. We have no idea who Stanley is. Like, we don't know who these characters are, what's going on. We know Teresa Banks' body has been found. But as far as we know from the show, Cooper was the one who was on the Teresa Banks case.
Yeah, exactly.
And we get to that point in this where he's actually following up on Desmond's disappearance. But I mean, one of the most important scenes in this entire movie to the mythology of Twin Peaks is the scene in Philadelphia with Cooper, Albert, and Gordon when Philip Jeffries walks into the building. And nobody at the time would ever understand how important this scene would be. The fact that Jeffries has been missing. And it just leads so much into the mythology of what is the Black Lodge, where is it? The fact that like we see Teresa getting murdered so far away from Twin Peaks just goes to show that evil can kind of just spread itself throughout the world, right? Because it's inside Leland. We get that idea that at the end of this movie that Bob wants to possess Laura. He wants that body. And Laura's death is kind of an escape from that fate. It's just, there's a lot of beauty to the symbolism and metaphors that Lynch is using in this film that wouldn't hit with network television.
Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest thing is just what wouldn't hit with network television. I mean, that's really like a lot of the stuff you can see that Lynch wanted to include at some point in the show, but that they were just going to never like let happen. I mean, it's really hard to believe that Twin Peaks debuted on what, ABC?
Yeah.
Hearing them like that's crazy. Like, think about the shows that are on ABC now and think about the fact that this was an ABC show at the time. That is mind-blowing. And that just tells you like the state of TV. HBO wasn't an option. And that's why like Twin Peaks, I would argue, might be the most important show ever because it actually did start to do this linear story stuff rather than soap operas and rather than these like one-offs, like CSI type things, whatever was coming out at that time. I don't even remember, but it's one of those shows that first started to show like what you can do with the medium of television. Now that's hard maybe for people to sit down and watch now 30 years later and say, oh no, this is phenomenal. But it's the same argument I make with Lost every time. They had to fill slots. Yeah, they had to fill so much time. That is so hard to do. Imagine, and we saw it with Showtime, but imagine if in 1990, they sat down with Lynch and said, you're going to make 2 seasons that are 10 episodes each. That's all you're getting. And you have to sit down, you have to do it, and you have to do it in a way that is palatable for 1990, not 2017 when David Lynch can literally do whatever he wants. Think about what Twin Peaks really would have been. Would it have been better or worse? It probably would have been better because you wouldn't have had so much filler. But at the same time, think about what Lynch is able to do because he had so much autonomy and because he's able to get us some of these characters and things that we wouldn't probably ever see. I mean, I always think with Twin Peaks, it's probably the first time you get trans representation in a show that's not negative in any way,
Yeah.
shape, or form. It's not even really referenced. It's just there's David Duchovny as a woman. That's it.
Mhm.
That's the whole thing. And he was doing that in 1991 on ABC in America. What in the world are we looking at? And I just think like it's fascinating what Twin Peaks is. And how it's something bigger, and like this movie feels dated in some aspects, but then it feels super Lynch in other aspects. And the show can sometimes feel dated, and the return can feel so weird. And yet when you add them all together, it really is just like this massive, massive creation that's just really incredible.
Yeah, it's when the return came out in 2017, it was kind of hard to see where it was going to go. And it was frustrating. It was frustrating watching the return the first time because all you want is Cooper and you get Dougie for 16 episodes.
Yeah.
But I do personally believe that the return gets better on a rewatch, especially after diving into Fire Walk with Me more and more. The more I dive into Fire Walk with Me, the more I realize that that is the tone the return is going for, and it's not Twin Peaks. Like, and a part of that comes down to like the choice of like who came back for the show and everything like that. Obviously, Lynch is limited by people who have died, but which is, I mean, it keeps getting worse the further on we're removed from it. Like, if we go back to season 4 of Twin Peaks, there's no Albert, which I don't know how you do after the return.
Yeah.
But Lynch just has this terrible. I mean, let's just talk about Fire Walk with Me, where the phrase comes from. Lynch wrote a poem for the show. Through the darkness of futures past, the magician longs to see one chance out between two worlds. Fire walk with me. And it's this haunting phrasing about, taking someone through hell with you. And that's what this movie is all about. It's the hell Laura Palmer is experiencing and her release from it in her death. It's so much to think that this came from a 2-season show that ran in 1990. I mean, this is a show that, like you said, shaped television. If Twin Peaks doesn't happen, The X-Files never happens.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And like, we would never get this like syndicated television like this. Twin Peaks it's so special because despite that it was on network television, it still had those Lynchian elements to it. It still had these kooky characters and that weird dialogue. It had the symbolism. It had these dark themes, these themes of like existentialism and evil. There's so much evil in Twin Peaks, which is so weird when you think about these characters that we've grown to love over the years because they're so good. But there's this darkness that hangs over this community. And we see that in Fire Walk with Me. Like, we don't get a lot of moments in like the Red Room with the dancing man and stuff like that. But we do get, we get the jumping man in this. And that is one of the most terrifying visuals I think Lynch has ever created, is the jumping man. And we see that room above the convenience store that's been referenced before and everything. And it's terrifying. It's so scary. And I don't know, Lynch just knew what he was doing to build his world. And that's what Fire Walk with Me does. It takes the idea of Twin Peaks, and it takes, because if you remember Twin Peaks, the idea of the Black Lodge wasn't introduced until the very end of season 2.
Yeah.
And then Lynch takes it and is like, no, this is actually what caused absolutely everything.
Yeah.
It's just brilliant to me. And every time I watch it, I just fall in love with it all over again.
Yeah, I mean, maybe one day I'll watch The Return again. I just don't know if I'll be able to. But, maybe one day I'll do it. We have Rocker with a Walker over here talking about all the places there. They filmed parts of Fire Walk with Me around Everett, Washington, right up the street from us. Laura Palmer's house and Donna's house are still there. I was able to go to the R&R and the Great Northern and everything. I went up to the gorge up in Washington and then went into that town, and it's insane. It was like being in a time warp, because when you sat down at, I forget the name of the diner, but it's, the R&R diner. You sit in there and it's the people who all know each other. Oh, is
Mhm.
Jim coming? No, he's not coming today. Oh, all right. It's all the regulars. And this was 4 years ago now, I guess, something like that. And it's just crazy to think like how inspired Lynch was by this community and how little it really has changed. The Great
Mhm.
Northern is awesome. Like, it's incredible. Like, just the whole town, it's very interesting to be in. And it's not hard to see why Lynch was inspired. So it's funny, John, I live in South Florida and I've been to the Twin Peaks town, and you live in Vancouver and you haven't been to the Twin Peaks town and you like Twin
I
Peaks
know I'm
more, but
2 hours
whatever.
away and I haven't been there yet. But to
It's
be fair,
so worth it though.
yeah, and I've been planning it. I've been planning it, but this thing called COVID got in my way.
Yeah, I feel you. But it's worth it, and it's really cool, and it kind of makes you even like Twin Peaks more if that's possible for you. But
Mhm.
it's so unique and it's so interesting, and it's really awesome. Um, but John, what was the best thing that you watched this week? And you said you barely watched anything, so let's hear it.
I watched a single movie this week, outside of the two that we're talking about today, and that was I rewatched His Girl Friday, which
Okay,
I mean is still just one of the funniest movies of all time.
that's a
I
good
think I
one.
enjoyed it even more this time than I did the first time I watched it. It's so funny. Cary Grant is just electric the entire movie. The snappy dialogue, everything. It's so funny. It's so wonderful. I was watching with a friend who really enjoys movies from that era, and she also loved it. It was just such a good time.
Yeah, I really like His Girl Friday. That's a super entertaining movie. I rewatched Robin Hood, the 1973 animated one. It's like one of my favorite Disney movies, maybe my favorite Disney movie. I just freaking love that movie. I think Prince John is so funny. But I watched finally in something new. I watched Playtime, the Jacques Tati movie. Is it
Mm.
Tati or Tati? Whatever it is. That is some movie, man. It is just a meandering all over the place. You're never focused. It just keeps moving. And the restaurant scene, which is like an hour long, is so freaking entertaining. It's just a lot of fun. And at first I was like, man, this is going to be so French. I'm not going to like this. And then as it kept going I was like, okay, this is really French, but this is also really funny, and it's really entertaining. It's really artistic. Really good movie. Definitely worth watching. The only other one that I will say is I did finally get around, and it's not a 4-star movie by any means, but I did finally get around to watching Heaven's Gate, which was Michael Cimino's movie that pretty much bankrupted United Artists. So much fun to watch that movie and to see how that really was the end of the director-driven era of the 1970s, and how Heaven's Gate pretty much single-handedly made it so that the 80s in Hollywood weren't going to be as good as the 70s were. It's so interesting to watch. Really long movie, like 4 hours long, whatever it was. Um, but so it's a good movie. Definitely a good movie. Has some monster set pieces that are just incredible. But it's so interesting to see how this movie like single-handedly ended everything that was going on in the
Mhm.
70s. And it was 2 years after he made The Deer Hunter. It's unreal, but worth a watch. Just interesting. Just wanted to throw that one out there. But let's talk about Little Miss Sunshine. From 2006. It's a comedy. It's unique as anything. And I would say if the Royal Tenenbaums was the definitive movie of the 2000s, this might be second.
Mhm.
This movie was I would say, the only spiritual sequel of any means to Royal Tenenbaums that actually worked. Um, Everything wanted to be the Royal Tenenbaums, like with this family, dysfunctional, whatever. And Little Miss Sunshine did it, and I think they did it better than the Royal Tenenbaums.
Mhm.
What Jonathan Dayton and Valerie Faris are able to pull off with all of these characters, making the van a character, making the location a character, you know everything about all of them. And that's so hard to do. This is an hour and 40 minutes long. It's a family, but everybody is relatable, even when you can't understand anything about them, like why they would be that way. But it's the music, and it's the story, and it's the fact that they're all failing in some way, and yet they all so badly want to succeed, and how Olive is the only one who's willing to just put it all out there to succeed. and she just keeps going for it she knows she's not a beauty queen. And yet she just keeps going for it while the rest of them are so worried about what's going to happen and this, that, and the other thing. I think that it's just such a perfect dysfunctional family movie, but it's just a perfect movie. This came out the same year as The Departed, which went on to win, pretty much everything. But this did win Best Original Screenplay, and Alan Arkin won Best Supporting Actor. But in my estimation, and I love Alan Arkin in this movie, this is Steve Carell's movie, and Steve Carell is just another level in this. This is really what launched him into, he can actually act. It's not just and Michael from The Office obviously shows off his acting chops, so I'm not saying that, but he wasn't just a comedian anymore. He was doing The Office, and then he made a movie like this. And that's why he's in movies like Foxcatcher further down the line. But I've always loved this movie. This is a movie that just hit me. It came out when I was 14 years old. I loved everything about it. It really relaunched or launched a lot of careers. I mean, Abigail Breslin's had an incredibly successful career for a child actor. Paul Dano has had an unbelievably successful career. Like I just said with Steve Carell, Toni Collette kind of like launched again after this. I mean, she was always kind of hot, but then this like really picked her up. And Greg Kinnear. I mean, this was huge for Greg Kinnear. Alan Arkin was old, and everybody already loved Alan Arkin, so don't say much for that. But it also has Walter White and whatever his name is. Why can I not? Hank. It has Walter White and Hank both in it. That's awesome. Granted, they're not very big parts, but they are in this movie, and I just thought that was funny that it's in New Mexico, and the next year they start making what is considered the greatest TV show of all time by many people. Anyway, all that to say, John, had you seen this before or no?
It has been about 15 years since I've watched this movie. I have seen it before, and I don't think it overstated at this point how big this movie was when it came out. And I was like, universally love this movie was because it's this really lighthearted family movie with like these deep emotional moments to it. And we see this family just struggling time and time again. Everyone's life seems to be falling apart, and we kind of just have all of their holding them all together. It's so funny. This movie was way funnier than I remember it being. It's so, you just can't help but smiling the entire time you watch this movie.
And the one scene when after Alan Arkin dies, and they're in the hospital and it starts to get dark. You're like, here we go. I call it like the American Pie, where American Pie is a pure like farce. And then all of a sudden they have to bring in like their emotional moment for no real reason. Like that's why I always love Step Brothers and always revere Step Brothers, because there is no serious moment. The serious moment in that movie is they have to go live on their own, and he's reading a book and going to bed by 10 o'clock, and he's wiping his butt with the carpet that, the toilet rug. Like, I love that stuff. And I think Little Miss Sunshine, it still hits that emotional note of like, wow, the grandpa's dead. The grandpa's had some great moments in this movie. He's the one who's really there for her. He's the one who's pushing her towards this goal. He's got his own problem. He's addicted to heroin. He's snorting. He's been kicked out of this place. He's got to live with his son who he really doesn't. And then they say, okay, let's now try to steal him from here because we got to keep going. It's such an absurd scene, and it immediately alleviates all that tension you were feeling. And while it's something that would never happen, just like at some point in life, Dwayne would have known he was colorblind. Like there's no way Dwayne's 15, 16 years old and they didn't know he was colorblind. They're going to do an eye test on you in school at some point to find out if you're colorblind. They're going to tell you to pick up the red crayon, and you're going to pick up the green one, and they're going to say, what the heck's wrong with you? But it doesn't matter, because it's about the journey that they're on, and it is this willing suspension of disbelief. This movie does such a good job of the willing suspension of disbelief, and I think so much of that comes to beauty contests themselves are a willing suspension of disbelief. That people are going to look like that and act like that and be talented and perfect and blah, 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 blah. That is a willing suspension of disbelief, because as soon as they leave, they have their problems, whatever it is, whether it's an eating disorder or just a mental problem or a physical problem or a family trouble. Nobody is perfect. And this movie, it's almost like it doesn't care when it's taking these chances and saying, this doesn't work, because it knows that you have to just believe what they're doing is how it would take place, just like if you're sitting down watching a beauty contest.
And exactly, and all these characters, the characters are the heart and soul of this movie, and
Mhm.
it really just comes down to the fact that all these characters are so deeply flawed.
Mhm.
I cannot tell you the amount of profanity I used in my notes to explain uh, Richard throughout the
Oh
first
my
half of this
God,
movie,
dude.
because he
Richard
is
is
the
brutal.
worst.
The worst.
And but that's okay, because it makes it pay off then when you get to the end of the movie and you see him just like sitting dumbfounded in this beauty pageant, being like, "What is this?"
Yeah.
And
I would honestly say that Richard might be the best overbearing abusive father figure like ever written. It's insane because it's all subtle and it's all real. It's not
mhm,
like Peter Boyle in Monsters Ball, where he's just a blatant racist, hates his son, blah blah blah. It's like this is a normal guy who is just so miserable in his own life and is failing at everything that he has to take it out on his kids in some way because he doesn't know what else to do. And yet, when he needs to be there for them the most, he starts to become the hero of the movie. And to
mhm.
write that arc is so hard because he is so despicable at the beginning. The ice cream scene is so brutal and so devastating. It's so uncomfortable to watch. And yet, then he's the one who says, we came all the way here. If there's one thing he would have wanted to see, it's Olive perform. And he's the one who's throwing him out the window. And he's the first one to go up there and start dancing to have his daughters back. Like, it's those moments. How do you take such an unlikable character and turn them into one of the heroes of the movie, if not the hero of the movie? It's really awesome how it's done. And go ahead, continue though, because I know you had more character stuff going. So
Yeah, but no, you're exactly right. Like, this is a character who should be irredeemable by the way he acts at the beginning of this movie. But it's like that moment where, everything falls apart for him. He goes, meets Bryan Cranston's character,
yep.
like just understands like it's not going to work, and then his dad dies, and he has that moment where he's just like, everything that he's been working towards here is pointless.
Mm-hmm.
But what's not pointless is the family he's on this trip with and this journey he's on there. And it's some of the greatest character writing ever done.
Mm-hmm.
And it's surrounded by, I mean, fantastic characters. Toni Collette's character just seems like this like typical like kind of like pushovery mom,
Yep.
but we see her getting firm and upset. And like the thing with these characters is they're all so real.
Yeah.
And that's, you compared it to Royal Tenenbaums. That's what Little Miss Sunshine does better than the Royal Tenenbaums,
I
because the
agree.
Royal Tenenbaums characters are, I mean, the Wes Anderson bit of absurdity to them. But what makes Little Miss Sunshine more successful than it is the fact that you can relate to these characters. Who
Yeah.
doesn't know the brooding 16-year-old who's into Nietzsche and decided to
Yeah.
not talk for a while, right? Like, these are characters, like, even the way that Steve Carell's character even addresses that entire situation is just exactly like, yeah, okay, you're just not
Yeah.
talking because of Nietzsche.
Yeah. Friedrich Nietzsche. That's the best. I wrote that in my review of this way back in the day. So the best part about Little Miss Sunshine is that depending on what point of your life you're in, you relate to a different character. Paul Dano's speech about high school seems so deep when you're in high school. Carell becomes relatable when you're struggling to come to terms with who you are. Kinnear is who you are when you're failing. Colette is who you are when you just can't hold it together anymore. Arkin is who you are when you throw caution to the wind because it doesn't matter. But in the end, it's all based around Breslin, who has a dream that everyone tells you is unattainable, but you insist it isn't. Like, that is every character in this movie. They are all so distinct and they all are dealing with their own things. I mean, the opening of this movie is one of my favorite openings ever. When it's bouncing from every single character and the music that's playing and Greg Kinnear's speech, how amazing that speech is. And then they reveal the audience and it's like 12 people just sitting there. And you're like, oh my God, that's his Super Bowl. That's his pump up. You're going to change the world. And it's some seminar nobody wants to be at. And then you got the grandpa snorting heroin. And then you got first it's Abigail Breslin doing the thing where she's covering her cheeks, pretending to be Little Miss Sunshine, sucking in her stomach. You have Paul Dano, who's doing his pull-ups and crossing off the things. You know everything about them. And then we get to Toni Collette arguing with her husband. because he has nowhere else to go. Richard, what do you want me to do? And we get there, and it's Frank, Steve Carell, sitting in the hospital with his wrists bandaged, and you know everything you need to know about that movie. Every single character has been established. Every single character's desires and flaws have been established. And we realize that we are looking at a family where nobody is successful, and yet they all want success so badly.
Mm-hmm.
And all they really have is each other. And that's what drives this movie the whole time. There doesn't need to be quirk to it. There doesn't need to be he lost the bomber, lost the tennis match because of, you know, whatever. I love that. Don't get me wrong. The Royal Tenenbaums we talked about 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago because of my list. But this movie doesn't need that. Instead, this movie takes the car and makes the car the final straw for all of them. The thing that they can't get away from that's annoying, but it's just adding to, it's really the car is what brings them all together. They can't stand to be around each other. And as soon as the car stops working because of Toni Collette, they have no choice but to come together and work together. And that's when we start to see how they develop as a family and how they grow. And it leads to every one of them standing up for Olive up on that stage because they're trying to pull her off, because how dare she ruin this?
Yeah, it's just such a rewarding moment at the end of this film to have the entire family just up there on stage dancing. And the fact that nothing really happens after that too, they just get back in the van. It's just a perfect close to this movie that tells you every single one of these people have grown and they now understand how important they all are to each other.
Yeah. And that moment where they open up the trunk of the car and Grandpa's not there anymore. Like, it's so devastating. He would have been really proud of you. Like, it's how do you make that hit after we just watched them make a joke out of this beauty contest? How do you still make that note hit so hard? Like that, to me, it's next level writing. And again, I go back to, it doesn't matter that he should have known he was colorblind by now. It doesn't matter any of the stuff, any of the little plot holes that people would want to poke at. They don't matter because it's the feel of this movie. It's what this movie is teaching you about family and adventure and just going for it, because life isn't freaking long. It's all there. And you get it from an 80-year-old who's addicted to heroin, and you get it from a little girl who's fat but wants to be a beauty queen, and she's like 7-8 years old. And then there's everybody in between. How they hit every single character. There's none of them that feel like a caricature. All of these characters are who the caricatures that follow are based on.
Yeah, exactly. There's just kind of these templates of characters who they hit these archetypes, but they're so unique in their own ways. And a lot of it just comes down to the performances. This cast is absolutely incredible, like top to bottom. The fact that you have, I mean, look at what some of these people did like immediately. Paul Dano went from this to There Will Be Blood.
I know.
Pretty good couple of years there for Paul Dano, and
for somebody who was not in anything until then.
Yeah, and like he's now developed arguably into one of the best actors of his generation. Yeah, and you just see him, and he doesn't even talk for most of this movie. Yep, and his performance is so good because he just captures like that teen angst so well by not saying anything, and it's even like when he's first writing down, and like Frank, they're at the dinner table at the beginning of the movie, and he writes down, "I hate everyone," and Frank's like, "Even your family." And it's like the emphasis he puts into underlining everyone tells you everything you need to know without a single word being uttered.
He doesn't need to speak. He just doesn't have to, and it works. And like Greg Kinnear just started doing movie after movie. I mean, he was in Invincible the same year as this, and then The Last Song and Green Zone and Ghost Town, and he just kept being in movies after this when it looked like he really wasn't going to be in anything. Now, none of these movies are massive, big blockbuster type things, but this was a guy who like he did As Good as It Gets, and he did what is it? You've Got Mail. And other than that, like he had fallen pretty much off. Like it wasn't like, you know, he's in movies here and there. I guess Stuck on You was a pretty popular one. But this just like, again, it was kind of like with Carell, it showed like there's a serious range to this guy. Like, as good as it gets, he plays such a one-note character, even if that one note is different than what you're used to seeing him in. There was such a range to the character that he plays in this one. But, you know, I just think, to me, it's Carell. I just can't help it. That's just what I say all the time. He's just phenomenal in this.
Especially when you consider like the timing of this, because like The Office, this would have been what, right after the second season of The Office.
Yeah.
So it's coming off the heels of the 40-Year-Old Virgin, which, I mean, the 40-Year-Old Virgin was such an iconic role for Steve Carell that it literally shaped the way Michael Scott in The Office was written from then on.
Yeah.
And we get him in this incredibly serious role. And the scene in the gas station,
so good.
So impeccably acted by Steve Carell. It's just like, you don't need to know who this person is. By his response, you already know everything. And that's what's so well written. Like, yes, this movie's well written, but that's what's so well acted in this movie. Is that it's these little motions. A few seconds in this movie can tell you an entire story. And that's what's so phenomenal about it.
And that's really what's happening. I mean, think about Stan Grossman, how minor of a character he is, Bryan Cranston's character. Such a minor character in this movie, and yet he really is the one who he holds more over this family than this family holds for themselves. I mean, Stan Grossman could be the most important character in this movie because Stan Grossman's why this is so important and why this is so difficult. And if it doesn't work, they're just going to keep eating the chicken, and they're running out of space in the house. They're running out of room for themselves. And that character is there. It's like pervading. It's like Hannibal Lecter. It's always there and always ruining everything because he just can't get in touch with him. Richard just can't get in touch with him. And finally he gets in touch with him. It's not going to work. And what are we going to do? There's nothing you can do. And now you've just hit your wit's end, and it's just, you just got to keep going. I mean, yeah, I think, you know, obviously Alan Arkin has some of the bigger speeches in the movie, you know, in the back of the car when he's talking about, you know, sleeping with a lot of women and all of that stuff and whatever, the Nazi bullets in his ass and all that stuff. But his scene with Abigail Breslin in the hotel room right before he dies is why he won the Oscar. It's a 1.5, 2 minute scene, and it is one of the best scenes of the entire movie. And it has the most emotion. And it feels like a real grandfather really talking to his granddaughter, and him knowing the world over and what's going to happen as she gets older and how this is going to be hard. She's in this family. She's got to deal with these people. She isn't the prettiest, but what does he say to her? And that conversation, it's just, it's beautiful. It's brilliant. And it's such a small moment that is so impactful. And then the next thing is he's dead. But she got that from him. Which is why when they're telling her at the end, you can't go out there, she's going out there. She's going to go out there and dance because she's ready to go. It's her time now, and she's going to do it for her grandfather who's in the back of their trunk.
Yeah, and it's so wonderful. Like, especially I really enjoy the fact that we get Richard's character just talking about, like, winners and losers the entire movie. And then we get Alan Arkin just saying, the only loser is the person who doesn't try. And, like, it's just such a heartfelt meaning behind this film that drives Olive. And like the whole beauty pageant scene at the end of this movie is so ridiculous. And it's probably more ridiculous because that's exactly how these things are.
Yeah, with the exception of a family that gets up and ruins it. But yes.
But like, it's exactly like that. And I love the fact that like the biker dad's there, like completely ignoring everything, and then is the one who like celebrates at the end afterwards. It just has this great feel of success of just like letting go and not caring, because there's so much about this movie is just caring about what the world thinks about everything. Right? It's the fact that Frank is no longer the #1 Prout scholar. And the fact that Richard can't make it as this motivational speaker. And I mean, Alan Arkin's character is the one who just doesn't give a crap, but that's because he's like 80 years old and on the brink of death at this point. He's just doing heroin because he's old and it doesn't matter. And at the end, there's just this release of them just letting go. And as they're sitting there with the police, like talking to them at the end, and they get that instruction of, we're going to let you go as long as she never competes in another beauty pageant in all of California. And Frank just going, I think we could live with that.
Yeah.
It's just this perfect amount of release of like, this family has been through so much in this, what was it, a week this movie takes place?
Yeah, it's like 4 days or 3 days, maybe not even. I think it's 3 days.
Yeah, they've been through so much, but they've come so far. And they've just grown so much in that time.
Yeah.
Because in the end, like, all those flaws we saw in these characters are now strengths in these characters.
Yeah, because they've learned to live with it all. And you know, Paul Dano's speech about if he wants to fly planes, he's going to fly planes. Like, who's going to tell him, so what? You can't tell him no. Like, there's so much of that growth in all of these characters of like, there's such a worry of the perception and how they're going through all of this. It really doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. Yeah. Just do what makes you happy and fuck the rest. I mean, that's literally the line. And it's coming, you know, I like it now that you're speaking again. Like, that's the high school mentality. But if older people had the same mentality as some high schoolers, not all, but some, they might be a little more self-confident. Have you ever met somebody like more self-confident than a high schooler? Probably not. No. Yeah, you know, you talk about the mental health stuff, but I'm just saying, like, somebody who's, I could take on I could do that. That's every high schooler.
Yeah, I mean, every high schooler feels like they're invincible, right? And they can take on the world. They think they understand the world better than adults. And, you know, sometimes they just do.
Yeah. And this movie with Paul Dano kind of shows that. Also, Paul Dano was like almost 30 when he made this, I think, or like in his 20s, like mid to late 20s, I want to say. He's 84. Yeah, he was 22 in this.
Okay. Damn.
Yeah. Just a baby though. But yeah, I just love Little Miss Sunshine. I mean, it's funny because, you know, I always talk about so many movies on my list are just flat out depressing. I mean, you know, we make fun of that all the time when we were talking about The Wrestler and The Hours and Shame, and we haven't even gotten into Magnolia yet, which is coming up in a couple weeks, or where the heck is the movie? I can't even remember, but like Lost in Translation is a depressing movie, and, you know, Blue Valentine, there it is. You know, I love these depressing movies, but then when you get a movie that knocks it out of the park, like Little Miss Sunshine, and just can hit you in all the emotions, those are really the movies, man. Like, that's why Moonrise Kingdom's in my top 10, and The Graduate, and Amelie, and Eternal Sunshine, American Beauty. Like, those are movies that hit you in every emotion. They don't just hit you in one emotion. They're hitting you in every emotion. And Little Miss Sunshine just does that for me. It just hits me, makes me feel sad. It makes me happy. It makes me nervous. You know, it hits everything. And that's just a testament to the writing. I mean, that's just unbelievably hard to do. Now, John, I have a trivia question for you.
Oh.
The writer of this movie.
Yes.
Okay. His name is Michael Arndt, I believe, right? Michael Arndt.
Okay.
Don't look it up. Who was he? He was the first screenwriter ever to what?
I don't know. What?
He was the first screenwriter to ever be nominated for the Oscar for Best Original Screenplay and Best Adapted Screenplay for his first two screenplays. The first two things he wrote, this was original. His second one was adapted. It came 4 years later when he wrote Toy Story 3.
Wow.
Yeah.
That also makes a lot of sense when you think about Toy Story 3.
Yeah. The whole family-ish aspect of everything.
Yeah, crazy. So yeah, he literally, and he was, when was he born? Does it even say? I don't even think it says, but he was a little bit older. I mean, he was working with Matthew Broderick in the 90s. Yeah.
You know, so whatever his age was, but yeah, he was nominated for Best Original Screenplay and then Best Adapted Screenplay. Still the only person ever to be nominated for those two categories for their first two screenplays. Because normally people get lumped in. You make an original, you're going to keep doing original. You make adapted, you're going to keep doing adapted. He went and did both. So
it's impressive.
And he won it for this one. He won it for Little Miss Sunshine. But yeah, I love Little Miss Sunshine. If you haven't seen it, check it out. So much fun. Really, really good movie. John, do you have anything else you want to say about Little Miss Sunshine?
It's just kind of this ultimate feel-good movie, which is weird to say when we're talking about like the depressing elements of this movie, but it's just balanced all so well that it's it's the type of movie where if you're feeling down, you can throw it on and it'll make you feel better.
Yep. Yep. That's exactly how I feel. And that's why it comes in here at number 30. All right, but next week we're going into our 20s. We're finally into the 20s, and we're not talking about John's number 29 because it's Moonrise Kingdom, and I have that so much higher. So instead, we're going to talk about the Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus from 2009. So we'll be covering that one. And for me, another 2009 movie, and it is my 29th. Wow, 2009 at number 29, 2 movies from that year. Wow, John. But I have The Secret in Their Eyes, and I'm talking about the original one, not the godforsaken Hollywood remake. I'm talking about the original. It's Argentinian, I believe. But whatever it is, Secret in Their Eyes. That's what I got. The Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus, which I actually haven't seen. So I'm excited to sit down and watch that one and see what I think it's all about. Become patrons, patreon.com/Survivor Specialist. You can join our Discord and we can talk about movies in there. I'm sure some people will actually start to join that once Survivor gets going in about a month here. I know people will start to flock over there a little bit more. So that should start to pick up when we hit around like 25 or so. And I think John and I had talked about we're probably going to be recording on either the 25th or 26th of next week. I believe that's what we had decided in terms of that's the Thursday, Friday of next week for doing these 2 movies. So a little bit of time here. We got a little off schedule. We've been dealing with some stuff, especially myself. And that's it. That's what I got. So John, thanks for jumping on the podcast, and everybody else, thanks for being here. And we'll see you all in just over a week.